The Zural Dominion had never lost a war. For 11,000 years, their battle fleets had crossed the galaxy like a slow gray tide, swallowing world after world, species after species, until their empire stretched across 4 spiral arms and touched the edges of known space. They called themselves the Eternal Hand, because nothing they closed their fingers around ever slipped free. Every species that met them either bowed or burned. There was no third option. Their commanders were bred for war from birth, trained in simulators older than most civilizations, and their ships were built from alloys mined from the cores of dead stars. When the Dominion scouts first detected the faint radio chatter drifting out from a small yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, nobody in the high command even blinked. It was just another signal. Another primitive species about to be added to the list. The scout ship that found Earth was called the Veda's Eye, a sleek reconnaissance vessel meant to observe, not engage. Its sensors swept through decades of human television broadcasts, military chatter, and satellite data, and its onboard intelligence began compiling a report. The report was almost insultingly short. Population, 7 billion. Technology level, pre-interstellar, chemical rockets, primitive fission weapons. Military capability, negligible by Dominion standards. Cultural notes, fractured into competing nations, prone to internal conflict, generally unaware of extraterrestrial life. The analyst who filed the report added one line at the bottom, almost as a joke: recommend standard annexation protocol. Estimated resistance, none of consequence. That line would later be studied by Dominion historians for generations, held up as the single most catastrophic misjudgment in the Empire's long history. The Dominion did not creep in quietly. That was not their way. They believed in the terror of open declaration, in giving lesser species one chance to kneel before the hammer fell. So 3 months after the Veda's Eye returned home, a Dominion fleet of 200 capital ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, well beyond Neptune's orbit, and broadcast a message on every frequency human technology could receive. The message was translated into every major human language by the Dominion's linguistic algorithms, which had spent weeks digesting Earth's broadcasts. It was blunt. It named Earth a Class 9 primitive world, ordered unconditional surrender within 72 hours, and promised that any resistance would be met with total planetary sterilization. The voice that delivered it was calm, almost bored, the voice of something that had given this same speech to 100 other frightened little civilizations and watched them all fold. For about 6 hours, the governments of Earth were in complete chaos. Emergency sessions were called. Military leaders argued over channels that had never been meant for this kind of crisis. Some officials wanted immediate surrender. Others wanted to fight, though nobody was quite sure what fighting even meant against a fleet of that size. But something strange happened as the hours ticked by. Instead of panic settling into despair, it settled into something colder. Something that looked, from orbit, almost like resolve. Humanity had spent the better part of a century preparing for exactly this kind of nightmare, though almost nobody outside a handful of classified programs knew it. After decades of half-serious science fiction warnings and increasingly serious data from deep space telescopes hinting that humanity was not alone, a quiet coalition of nations had spent 30 years building something the Dominion scouts had never detected: a network of deep bunkers, orbital defense platforms disguised as commercial satellites, and railgun batteries buried under mountains, all designed under the assumption that first contact might not go well. The program had a boring, bureaucratic name, but the people who worked on it called it the Long Winter Project, because it was built on the belief that if aliens ever came, humanity's best chance was not to win quickly, but to survive long enough to make winning quickly impossible for the other side. When the ultimatum arrived, the Long Winter Project activated in full for the first time. Command bunkers deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain and the Ural Range, and the Australian outback lit up with decades-old contingency plans. Reserve officers who had trained for this exact scenario in classified simulations for their entire careers were called in. And quietly, without any announcement to the public, without any dramatic broadcast back to the Dominion fleet, Earth's defense network began waking up. The Dominion, watching through their sensors, saw nothing that alarmed them. Human satellites moved a little, some new heat signatures appeared underground, but nothing that matched anything in their threat database. Admiral Threxaval, commanding the invasion fleet, found the whole thing rather dull. He had expected pleading transmissions, maybe a few desperate token military mobilizations that his sensors would swat aside like insects. Instead, there was silence. He put it down to primitive shock. He was not wrong that the humans were afraid. He was very wrong about what they would do with that fear. 72 hours came and went. No surrender transmission arrived. Threxaval was almost personally offended. He gave the order to begin what the Dominion called a demonstration strike, a small, contained bombardment meant to convince the stubborn natives that resistance truly was pointless, without wasting the resources of a full assault. 12 warships broke formation and began their descent toward low orbit, aiming for an unpopulated stretch of desert, planning to carve a visible scar into the planet's surface as a warning nobody could ignore. They never reached firing range. As the 12 ships crossed the boundary humanities scientists had spent 30 years quietly mapping and preparing for, the sky over 3 separate hemispheres lit up with railgun fire from batteries the Dominion sensors had completely failed to identify, hidden as they were beneath mountains and disguised as ordinary geological formations. The projectiles were not exotic. They were simple slugs of dense metal, moving at speeds that made them, for all practical purposes, invisible until impact. Dominion shields, designed to stop energy weapons and the kind of plasma ordnance every other species in the galaxy used, had never been tested against pure kinetic strikes moving at those velocities. 4 ships were crippled in the first exchange. 2 more were destroyed outright, their reactors breached, blooming into brief, silent fireballs against the black of space. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Threxaval stared at the tactical display in something close to disbelief. In 11,000 years of Dominion history, no class, 9 primitive world, had ever done this. The confidence that had carried the eternal hand across 4 spiral arms, the certainty that had let a single analyst dismiss an entire species with one careless sentence, cracked for the first time. It did not shatter yet. Threxaval was still a Dominion admiral, still bred to believe his empire could not lose. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, cold thought took root. Perhaps this world was not what the report had said it was. Down on Earth, in the command bunker beneath Cheyenne Mountain, a woman named General Elena Cho watched the same tactical feed with a very different expression. She had spent 11 years of her career preparing for a day she had privately doubted would ever come. Now that it had, she felt no triumph, only a grim, focused clarity. 2 Dominion ships destroyed did not mean the war was over. It meant the real war was just beginning, and the Dominion, humiliated and furious, would not make the same mistake twice. She picked up the comm and gave the order that would define the next chapter of the war. Full activation. Every hidden defense platform, every railgun battery, every orbital mine. The Long Winter Project, 3 decades in the making, was no longer a contingency. It was Earth's only shield against an empire that had never lost, and was about to learn, far too late, exactly what that word meant. The message that went out from Threxaval's flagship back to Dominion High Command that night was short, and unlike any report filed about Earth before it. It contained no boasts, no dismissive language, only a single flag priority request: reinforcements, full battle fleet, immediate. For the first time in living memory, a Dominion admiral was asking for help against a primitive world. High Command read the request 3 times before approving it, unable to quite believe what they were looking at. Somewhere in that reading room, an old strategist who had fought in 100 campaigns felt an unfamiliar chill settle over him, though he could not yet say why. He would understand soon enough. So would the rest of the galaxy. The reinforcement fleet that arrived 11 days later dwarfed the first. Where Threxaval had brought 200 ships expecting a formality, Dominion High Command now sent 800, along with 3 of their most decorated war commanders, and a new directive: subdue the planet's surface defenses first, then move to full occupation. They had studied the recording of the failed demonstration strike frame by frame, and their engineers had already begun retrofitting shield generators to compensate for kinetic weapons. The Dominion did not repeat mistakes. That was the other half of their reputation, the half that made them truly dangerous. They learned fast, and they never underestimated an enemy twice. But humanity had used those 11 days well too. General Cho and her counterparts across the world's remaining functioning governments had watched the same battle footage from 100 different sensor angles, and they understood something the Dominion did not yet grasp. The first battle had only worked because it was a surprise. The second battle would need to be something else entirely. It would need to be a trap. Earth scientists had spent decades studying not just weapons, but the gaps between what the wider galaxy assumed was possible and what it actually was. Human physicists, cut off from any galactic knowledge-sharing network, had developed odd, sideways solutions to problems the rest of the galaxy had abandoned centuries ago as impractical. One of these was a class of stealth technology using layered metamaterials that did not cloak a ship so much as make its sensor signature indistinguishable from background radiation. It was slow, difficult, absurdly expensive to produce, and completely unlike anything Dominion sensors were built to filter out, because the Dominion had never needed subtlety. They had never needed to hide, because nothing had ever been able to hurt them badly enough to make hiding necessary. Under the deserts of Nevada and the frozen expanse of Antarctica, humanity had built 22 of these stealth platforms over the previous decade, originally intended as an absolute last resort deterrent. They were not warships in the traditional sense. Each one was essentially a single enormous railgun married to a fusion reactor and wrapped in enough stealth material to make it invisible to the Dominion's entire fleet, provided it did not fire more than once before relocating. The doctrine behind them was almost embarrassingly simple. Hit hard, disappear, wait, repeat. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of tactic that made for stirring speeches. But it worked precisely because it required patience the Dominion had never needed to develop. When the reinforcement fleet settled into high orbit, confident in their upgraded shields, the 22 platforms waited 3 full days before firing a single shot. Dominion tacticians grew steadily more suspicious of the silence, some even suggesting the humans had simply given up, that the first battle had been a fluke born of panic rather than genuine strategy. Frexaval, still commanding despite his earlier humiliation, was not so sure. He had seen the tactical data from the first engagement personally, and something about the humans' patience unsettled him more than open aggression would have. He was right to be unsettled. On the fourth day, without warning, all 22 platforms fired within the same 90-second window, each one targeting a different capital ship, each shot calculated for maximum structural damage rather than simple destruction. The new shields held against most of the impacts, exactly as Dominion engineers had promised. But 4 ships, positioned at unlucky angles, took direct hits to reactor housings that no shield upgrade could fully protect, and the resulting explosions tore through nearby formations, damaging 6 more vessels in the chain reaction. By the time Dominion sensors managed to trace the origin points of the kinetic strikes, the platforms had already gone dark and begun the long, slow process of relocating underground. Dominion High Command's response was, in its own way, entirely predictable. Furious at the continued losses and unwilling to accept that a primitive world could keep humiliating the Eternal Hand, they authorized what they called a cleansing bombardment, a strategy normally reserved for genuinely dangerous rival civilizations. Rather than attempting careful occupation, the fleet began systematically targeting Earth's largest cities from orbit, hoping that mass destruction and civilian casualties would force capitulation before humanity could develop whatever came next in this maddening pattern of surprises. This was, in hindsight, the Dominion's second great miscalculation, and by far the more costly one. Humanity's governments had known from the start of the Long Winter Project that if the situation ever escalated to bombardment of population centers, the war would stop being about clever tactics and become about survival at a civilizational scale. Evacuation protocols that had been rehearsed in classified drills for over a decade went into effect within hours of the first bombardment run, moving tens of millions of people into deep underground shelters built specifically for this nightmare scenario. It was not perfect. Cities burned. People died, more than anyone in the command bunkers wanted to think about, and General Cho would carry the weight of every name on those casualty lists for the rest of her life. But the Dominion strategy of using civilian devastation to break morale ran into something they had never encountered in 11,000 years of conquest. A species that, rather than breaking, grew colder and more determined with every loss. Something else began happening that the Dominion's analysts, still working from their original flawed assessment, had never accounted for. Humanity was not one unified command structure with a single point of failure. It was hundreds of nations, some cooperating fully with the Long Winter Project, others operating independent defense programs the coalition did not even know about. As Dominion bombardment runs continued, previously unknown resistance emerged from places their tacticians had no data on at all. A Russian orbital laser array disguised as a communications relay, a Chinese fleet of underwater railgun platforms capable of striking targets in low orbit through the ocean's surface, an Indian software collective that had, over years of quiet paranoid preparation, built cyber warfare tools capable of worming into Dominion targeting systems through the compromised civilian satellites the Dominion had captured and repurposed for their own sensor network. None of these individual efforts was, on its own, capable of turning the tide of the war. But together, arriving in overlapping waves that the Dominion could never quite predict or fully counter, they turned what should have been a swift, brutal conquest into a grinding, humiliating stalemate. Every week, Dominion casualty reports grew longer. Every week, Threxaval's requests for further reinforcement grew more urgent, and every week, the confidence that had defined the eternal hand for 11,000 years eroded a little further, replaced by something the Dominion had never had to feel before in living memory: doubt. Deep in a command bunker that had, over 3 brutal months of war, become as much a home as any of them had left, General Elena Cho stood before a room of exhausted officers and delivered words that would later be remembered as one of the turning points of the war. She told them that the Dominion had built an empire on the assumption that every species they met would eventually break, that resistance was simply a delay before the inevitable. She told them that humanity's entire strategy, from the very first railgun shot to the deep bunkers holding millions of survivors, rested on proving that assumption wrong, not through one decisive victory, but through refusing, day after brutal day, to give the Dominion the surrender it had never once failed to receive. It would take 2 more years of brutal, costly war before the Dominion finally understood, far too late, exactly how wrong that first analyst's report had been. By the second year of the war, the conflict had stopped looking anything like what either side had originally expected. Dominion High Command, humiliated by mounting losses and unable to explain to their own government how a Class 9 primitive world had turned into the single most costly campaign in the Empire's history, finally abandoned Threxaval's methodical approach and appointed a new supreme commander, Grand Marshal Kesseth Dra, a war leader whose reputation had been built on breaking sieges other commanders considered unwinnable. Kesseth Dra did not believe in demonstration strikes or gradual escalation. She believed in overwhelming force applied all at once, and she brought with her the largest single fleet the Dominion had assembled in 3 centuries, 2,000 warships, an orbital shipyard capable of repairing battle damage without returning to friendly territory, and a new class of adaptive shielding designed specifically to counter both kinetic weapons and the cyber warfare intrusions that had plagued earlier fleets. Her arrival changed the character of the war almost overnight. Where the previous 2 years had been a series of costly but survivable skirmishes, Kesseth Dra's opening campaign was a systematic, ruthlessly efficient effort to locate and destroy every hidden human defense platform, one region at a time, using swarms of small reconnaissance drones too numerous and too cheap for humanity's stealth technology to fully hide from. Within the first month, 6 of the original 22 railgun platforms were located and destroyed. Within 3 months, the underwater Chinese railgun network had been forced into hiding so deep and so cautious that it could barely contribute to the war effort at all. For the first time since the war began, morale in the human command bunkers began to genuinely waver, not because anyone doubted the cause, but because the numbers, coldly laid out on tactical displays, were starting to look unwinnable. It was in this darkest stretch of the war that humanity's less conventional advantage finally came to matter more than any single weapon. The Dominion, for all its military brilliance, had spent 11,000 years fighting species that thought about war the way the Dominion did. Fleets against fleets, planets surrendering when their defenses were sufficiently degraded, populations submitting once resistance became mathematically pointless. Humanity, isolated for its entire history and shaped by a past full of conflicts far messier and more stubborn than clean fleet engagements, simply did not process mathematically pointless the same way. Groups of scientists, soldiers, and ordinary civilians across dozens of nations began improvising solutions that no centralized command structure would ever have approved, because they were too strange, too risky, or too far outside doctrine to make it through official channels. One such group, a mixed team of Japanese robotics engineers and American software specialists working out of a repurposed mining facility in the Rockies, had spent over a year developing something they only half-jokingly called the Swarm, a network of thousands of cheap, semi-autonomous drones designed not to fight Dominion ships directly, but to overwhelm and confuse the very reconnaissance drone swarms HFY was using to hunt human defenses. Individually, each human drone was almost laughably primitive compared to Dominion technology. But in overwhelming numbers, cheap enough to produce that losing thousands of them meant nothing, they created so much sensor noise and false signal data that Dominion reconnaissance efficiency collapsed by more than half within weeks of deployment. At the same time, a coalition of scientists working under the Long Winter Project's original charter finally completed something they had been quietly developing since before the war even began, a weapon system based not on kinetic force or energy discharge, but on a specific harmonic resonance frequency that, when applied precisely to Dominion shield generator housings, caused a feedback cascade the Dominion's engineers had never designed against, because no species in the galaxy's long history of war had ever bothered to look for it. It was not a weapon that worked well against a single ship. It required enormous, room-sized generators and painfully precise targeting, and it took the human science team's years of failure to make functional. But against HFY's overconfident fleet, gathered in tight formation for a final coordinated assault meant to end the war once and for all, it proved devastating in a way nothing before it had been. The battle that followed, later remembered by military historians on both sides as the Siege of the Pacific Array, would become the true turning point of the war. HFY, confident after months of systematic victories, committed nearly her entire fleet to a single overwhelming strike meant to finally silence humanity's remaining defenses in the Pacific region. She did not know that the region's defenses included 3 of the newly completed harmonic resonance generators, hidden deep beneath the ocean floor and connected to a network of decoy signals designed by the very swarm drones that had been quietly degrading Dominion reconnaissance for months. As her fleet closed into formation, confident their new adaptive shields would hold against anything humanity could throw at them, the resonance generators activated in perfect synchronization. The effect was unlike anything either side had seen in the war so far. Rather than the sudden, visible destruction of a kinetic strike, entire sections of the Dominion fleet's shielding simply failed, cascading outward from ship to ship as the resonance frequency propagated through their tightly packed formation exactly as human physicists had calculated it would. Without shields, decades-old railgun platforms that had survived the drone hunts by staying hidden and patient finally opened fire in full, no longer needing to preserve themselves for some future engagement, because this was the engagement everything had been building toward. In less than 20 minutes, over 300 Dominion warships were destroyed or crippled beyond repair, the single largest loss the Dominion had suffered in any battle in recorded history, against any species, in 11,000 years of expansion. Grand Marshal HFY survived the battle, but her flagship did not escape unscathed, and neither did her reputation. As she withdrew what remained of her fleet to regroup, the message she sent back to Dominion High Command was very different from the confident reports that had characterized the Empire's communications at the start of the war. It was, for the first time in the Dominion's long history, a message that used the word unwinnable, not about some rival empire or ancient enemy, but about the primitive world their own analyst had once dismissed with a single careless sentence. Back on Earth, in a command bunker that had become almost a second capital city over the course of the war, General Elena Cho received the intercepted transmission with a tired, quiet satisfaction that she did not allow herself to fully feel until she was alone that night. The war was not over. There would be more battles, more losses, More names added to lists she still could not read without her hands shaking slightly. But for the first time since that first ultimatum had arrived from beyond Neptune's orbit, she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that humanity was going to win. The months following the siege of the Pacific Array brought a strange, uneasy shift to the war, one that neither side fully understood until much later. The Dominion did not withdraw. Their pride, built over 11,000 years of unbroken conquest, would not allow a single catastrophic defeat to end a campaign, no matter how costly. But the character of their strategy changed in ways that revealed, more clearly than any battle report could, just how deeply humanity's resistance had shaken the Empire's confidence. Keseth Dra was recalled to Dominion territory in disgrace, replaced by a council of 3 commanders rather than a single supreme leader, a structural change that Dominion historians would later note had not been used in over 2,000 years. Since the last time the Empire faced a threat its leadership genuinely could not agree on how to handle. The new triumvirate of commanders adopted a strategy built on caution rather than overwhelming force, a strategy that, ironically, played directly into humanity's greatest strength. Rather than committing large fleets to decisive engagements, the Dominion began a slow, grinding campaign of attrition, picking off isolated defense installations one at a time, avoiding the kind of tight formations that had made the Pacific Array so devastating. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, a sound decision. It was also, from a strategic standpoint, exactly the kind of prolonged, patient conflict that the Long Winter Project had been built to survive from the very beginning. Humanity used this shift in Dominion strategy to do something the Dominion's analysts, even after 2 years of costly lessons, still did not fully anticipate. They began fighting back, not just defensively, but offensively, in space itself. The same shipyards and engineering teams that had spent years perfecting hidden railgun platforms and harmonic resonance generators had also, quietly, and without much confidence that it would ever be needed, begun designing humanity's first true warships, vessels built not to hide beneath mountains or ocean floors, but to fight in open space using everything learned from 2 years of brutal, improvised warfare. The first of these ships, a class humanity named the Guardian series, launched in secret from a shipyard hidden in the asteroid belt, an industrial complex the Dominion's reconnaissance had written off years earlier as an abandoned, resource-poor mining operation not worth investigating further. The Guardian ships were not, by Dominion standards, particularly impressive vessels. They were smaller, less heavily armored, and carried fewer weapons than a comparable Dominion cruiser. But they carried something the Dominion had never encountered in any of the hundreds of species it had conquered over 11,000 years. Crews who had spent 2 years learning, in the most brutal way possible, exactly how Dominion tactics worked, exactly where their shields were weakest, and exactly how to exploit the gap between Dominion doctrine and the messy, unpredictable reality of a war against an enemy that refused to follow the script. The first major engagement involving the Guardian fleet, a battle near the orbit of Mars that would later be remembered simply as the Battle of Red Dawn, was not a large engagement by the standards of the war. Only 40 Guardian ships faced a Dominion patrol fleet of 60 vessels, a fight that, on paper, should have favored the more experienced, better-equipped Dominion forces. But the human crews, applying 2 years of hard-won lessons about resonance frequencies, drone swarm tactics, and the specific blind spots in Dominion sensor arrays, fought with a coordination and adaptability that stunned the Dominion patrol commander so completely that he broke formation entirely within the first 10 minutes of the engagement, a decision that Dominion doctrine considered almost unthinkable, and one that cost him nearly half his fleet before he managed to retreat. News of the battle spread through both human and Dominion command structures with very different effects. For humanity, already exhausted by 2 years of brutal war, the Battle of Red Dawn became a symbol, proof that the species that had once been dismissed with a single careless sentence in a scouting report could now meet the Dominion on genuinely equal terms in open space, not just through clever hidden defenses, but through direct confrontation. For the Dominion, the battle became something closer to a crisis of identity. 11,000 years of unbroken conquest had built an empire whose entire culture, from its military doctrine to its art and literature, rested on the assumption that the Eternal Hand simply did not lose wars. That assumption had already been badly shaken by 2 years of costly, grinding conflict. The Battle of Red Dawn shattered what remained of it entirely. Word of Earth's resistance began spreading beyond the immediate war zone, carried by refugee populations from worlds the Dominion had previously conquered, populations who had spent generations believing resistance to the Eternal Hand was simply impossible. For the first time in the Empire's long history, whispers of rebellion began stirring in conquered systems that had been peacefully, if resentfully, compliant for centuries. Dominion High Command, already stretched thin by the costs of the Earth campaign, found itself facing something far more dangerous than a single stubborn planet. The growing possibility that the myth of Dominion invincibility, once broken, could not be repaired, no matter how the war on Earth eventually ended. It was against this backdrop, 3 years after the first ultimatum had arrived from beyond Neptune's orbit, that Dominion High Command made the decision that would ultimately end the war, though not in the way anyone on either side initially expected. Recognizing that continued conflict risked not just further military losses, but the collapse of the Empire's authority across its entire conquered territory, the triumvirate of commanders quietly began exploring the possibility of something the Dominion had never once done in 11,000 years of expansion, a negotiated withdrawal. The first indication that something had fundamentally changed came not from a battle, but from silence. For nearly 6 weeks following a series of coordinated Guardian fleet strikes against Dominion supply lines throughout the outer solar system, Dominion forces made no major offensive moves at all. Human intelligence analysts, so accustomed to interpreting Dominion silence as preparation for some larger, more devastating strike, initially treated the quiet with deep suspicion, assuming it was the calm before an escalation none of their existing models could predict. General Elena Cho, now leading a coalition command structure that had grown far more unified and sophisticated over 3 years of shared sacrifice, ordered increased reconnaissance across every front, certain that the Dominion was regrouping for something worse than anything humanity had faced so far. What her analysts eventually discovered was something none of them had dared to hope for. Deep space listening posts, quietly monitoring Dominion communication channels using decryption techniques developed by the same coalition of engineers who had built the harmonic resonance generators, intercepted fragments of internal Dominion communications discussing something entirely unprecedented in the Empire's history, a formal proposal, moving slowly through the triumvirate's fractured command structure to open direct communication with Earth's coalition government, not to demand surrender, but to discuss terms of withdrawal. The proposal, when it finally arrived as an official transmission 3 weeks later, was almost unrecognizable compared to the arrogant ultimatum that had started the war. Gone was the cold, bored confidence of that first broadcast, the casual assumption that a Class 9 primitive world would simply kneel once shown sufficient force. In its place was something far more careful, almost hesitant, a tone that Dominion linguists, translating their own leadership's words into human languages for the first time in the war, struggled to render without sounding as though the Empire itself did not quite know how to address an enemy it could no longer confidently claim to be superior to. The negotiations that followed took place not in some grand ceremonial hall, but in a heavily secured neutral station constructed in the empty space beyond Neptune's orbit, the same region from which the Dominion's first ultimatum had been broadcast 3 years earlier, a detail that General Cho made sure was not lost on the Dominion representatives when the coalition proposed the location. The talks were tense, slow, and repeatedly threatened to collapse entirely as both sides struggled to reconcile 3 years of brutal losses with the reality that neither could fully claim victory. The Dominion triumvirate, still deeply reluctant to admit outright defeat to a species their own histories would later struggle to properly categorize, insisted on language that framed the withdrawal as a strategic reallocation of resources rather than a retreat. Humanity's negotiators, exhausted but unwilling to accept anything less than genuine, verifiable withdrawal and a binding commitment against future aggression, refused to sign anything that left room for the Dominion to return once its forces had recovered. It took another 4 months of careful, grinding negotiation, conducted even as sporadic fighting continued in isolated pockets of the solar system where communication had not yet reached every unit, before both sides finally reached an agreement that history would come to call the Neptune Accord. Under its terms, the Dominion agreed to a complete withdrawal of all forces from the solar system, a formal recognition of Earth's sovereignty and independence from any future territorial claims by the Empire, and reparations in the form of technological knowledge sharing meant to help rebuild the parts of Earth devastated by 3 years of war. In exchange, humanity agreed to remain outside Dominion-controlled space for a period of 50 years, a clause that Dominion negotiators had insisted on desperately, less out of genuine strategic concern and more, analysts on both sides suspected, out of a need to preserve some fragment of dignity in an agreement that was, by any honest measure, an unprecedented concession from an empire that had never before negotiated the terms of its own retreat. The final Dominion fleet withdrew from the solar system on a clear morning 3 years and 4 months after the first ultimatum had arrived, a departure marked not with grand ceremony, but with quiet, exhausted relief in command bunkers across the world that had, for 3 years, become as familiar to their occupants as any home ever had. General Elena Cho stood in the same bunker beneath Shine Mountain, where she had first watched Dominion ships appear on tactical displays, and this time, she watched those same displays slowly clear as the last Dominion vessel crossed back beyond the edge of the solar system, leaving human space for what many hoped, and some quietly doubted, might be the last time. The war left deep scars on Earth. Cities that had stood for centuries were gone. Populations that had once numbered in the millions had been reduced to fractions of what they were, and the psychological weight of 3 years of existential conflict would shape human culture, politics, and science for generations to come. But it also left something else, something that no Dominion analyst's careless first report could ever have predicted. A species that had entered the war fractured, uncertain, and technologically outmatched, and emerged from it unified in a way it had never managed to achieve on its own, holding technology and hard-won knowledge that would eventually let humanity build not just defenses, but a genuine place among the wider galaxy of species the Dominion had spent 11,000 years conquering. Word of Earth's resistance, and of the Dominion's unprecedented withdrawal, spread across conquered systems far faster than either side's diplomats could control. In the decades that followed, the myth of the Eternal Hand's invincibility, already badly cracked by 3 years of war against a single stubborn world, continued to erode, feeding rebellions and resistance movements across dozens of systems that had, for centuries, believed resistance was simply impossible. Dominion historians would spend generations debating exactly where the Empire's long, unbroken record of conquest had truly gone wrong, and while their debates would touch on strategy, technology, and command decisions throughout the war, they would always return, eventually, to that first careless line in a scouting report from a small yellow star nobody in the Empire had ever bothered to take seriously. Recommend standard annexation protocol, estimated resistance, none of consequence. They had been wrong about almost everything else in that report, but they would never again make the mistake of being wrong about humanity twice.